Kita juga harus tegas menghadapi infiltrasi.
We need to clamp down on ideological infiltration, such as extremism, radicalism, terrorism, marring the joints of our nation. There is now a wall holding us back from drawing a line as we're committing to the Panchasilla, the 1945 Constitution, the Republic of Indonesia, and unity in diversity.
The Indonesian parliament has approved a presidential decree to ban civil organizations deemed against the country's ideology. Known as Panchasilla, the theory is based on 5 principles, including national unity, social justice, and a belief in God. But the decree has been heavily criticized. Some argue it limits free speech and allows authorities to silence dissent. Meanwhile, President Joko Widodo has appointed a special envoy to promote religious harmony at a time when critics say Indonesia's diversity and religious tolerance are under threat. Well, to help us understand all of this, we are joined now from Jakarta by Tobias Basuki. He's a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Tobias. Tell us, is religious tolerance in Indonesia under threat, or is it being protected?
Overall, in general, religious tolerance and relations between religious communities had been somewhat under threat in the past so-called 10-15 years. But in regards to this particular presidential instruction that's recently made into law, I believe it's a different arena altogether. It's more of a one thing, the government policy. It's more actually a political action in regards to directly looking ahead against political oppositions for the 2019 presidential election that will come in 2 years.
Okay, so can you clarify that there is no interest, or in fact disinterest really, in actually protecting Indonesia's secular state?
Yes, to some extent it is almost an undemocratic way to protect so-called Indonesia's secular position by, in this case, disbanding the Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. But of course, critics both from the religious groups and also at the same time from freedom and democracy activists has criticized the government for using that law. But that being said, of course, it's in principle a hit on a democratic principle, but this is not something that's completely new. This actually, the previous law on civil society organization had existed in Indonesia since 1985, and it has just been revised to actually particularly undermine Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. So this is what is going on, and in effect, this is actually a government move because most of the opposition towards the current government usually comes from the more religious right groups, including Hizbut Tahrir, that often uses religious ideas to religious narratives to actually challenge the current government. So the disbanding of Hizbut Tahrir by using this presidential instruction is essentially actually rather a limited political attack against this particular group. But of course, in principle, it may have potential longer consequences.
And I mean, tell us about those consequences. Where does this leave the political opposition? Where does it leave religious minorities? Should they have something to genuinely fear?
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. I believe in regards to religious minorities at this point, at the present government, it is often considered a pluralist coalition, which often is accused actually of not accommodating to the more ultra-conservative religious groups. So this is what's going on. But the problem with the extension of this civil society organization law, which in return was actually re-strengthened by the president's instruction to ban an organization that is deemed anti-Panchasilla, which is the nation's ideology, is feared to be almost a gray principle, which you can name anything to be anti-Panchasilla. But in action, it is not actually that problematic yet under this administration, because even the banning of Hizb ut-Tahrir really took a lot of concession and compromise between various groups, and it has been agreed by the two largest Indonesian Muslim organizations. Hence, it's not that easy to just ban any organization just for the sake of being anti-Panchasila or against the government.
Okay. We just saw some pictures on our screen, actually, of Basuki Purnama, or Ahok, a Christian who'd run for governor, a popular politician. He was convicted of blasphemy on what some call very flimsy charges. Government critics say it is a clear example of a crackdown on anything that is not Islamic and threatening the current government. Is that how you see it as well, or was his case more specific than that?
Yes, his case is actually more specific. So what is currently happening between the recent imprisonment of the previous Jakarta governor and heading towards the 2019 election is the coalition of the government, which is consisting of new politicians, more on a nationalist line of groupings, against actually what is going on from the opposition, which is more of ultra-conservative religious right from the opposition. Although the leaders of the opposition are not necessarily religious leaders themselves, but there's often religious pretext. So that is the contention that is ongoing currently in Indonesia. And the presidential instruction on disbanding Hizb ut-Tahrir was often criticized by the opposition in Indonesia to be a reaction because there's so much pressure from the religious groups against the previous governor Ahok to be imprisoned, and hence he is actually preparing himself to actually attack these opposition because they attack these nationalist politicians.
Okay. Now, regardless of any laws they put in place, there really is an atmosphere of intolerance and the persecution, really, of religious minorities. There's a perception from the outside that that's what's going on. Indonesia has actually even seen the rise of gated communities for Muslims only. Tell us how that atmosphere, that perception can and should be addressed.
And that's where it gets very complicated because overall, I think the religiosity in Indonesia started to increase after the breakdown of the authoritarian regime in '98. But the problem was what this religiosity is translated as has never been translated well by either the government or by the major religious groups. And currently, in the very highly contested political contestations, it's actually often the either radical and ultra religious groups that are defining it in very narrow and strict terms, and also politicians for political benefits. And hence, that's why the religiosity has been translated into a very narrow and restrictive, that is in opposition towards Indonesia's multiculturalism. That's why we've been seeing a lot of attacks against the Ahmadiyya community, which had never been a problem in the past 30, 40 years, and also against the Shiite groups and also other minority religious groups like the Christians. So that has been on the rise because that religiosity, which initially was actually a neutral thing, was translated into a political narrative to actually attack opposition, whether be it in the regions or at the national level.
Okay. Tobias Basuki, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from Jakarta.
Sure.